The second time, I forgave the unforgivable. The world remembers my forgiveness of the woman caught in adultery. They remember my quiet command, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone." They remember the profound grace offered to the one trapped in the immediate, visible shame of her sin. That was a miracle of mercy, the healing of a wound that bled openly. But there was a second time I forgave the unforgivable, a forgiveness offered not to a visible sinner caught in the act, but to one whose sin was a calculated, deliberate act of betrayal. A forgiveness extended not to save a life from stones, but to save a soul from the ultimate corrosive shame of its own failed promise. It was the forgiveness I offered to Peter after he had publicly, vehemently, and repeatedly denied me. The first unforgivable sin is the one committed against the truth, the sin of denial, of choosing comfort over conviction. The second unforgivable sin is the one committed against the knowledge, the sin of betrayal, of choosing gain over loyalty. The betrayal of Judas was a tragedy of greed, but it was swift and final. The denial of Peter was a deeper, more agonizing tragedy of human frailty, unfolding across the most critical hours of my passion. I knew exactly what Peter would do. I had seen the scene play out in the silence of my prescience long before it ever materialized in the high priest's courtyard. I had warned him not to condemn him, but to prepare him for the devastating revelation of his own weakness. "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. His protest, "Even if I must die with you, I will not deny you," was not a lie. It was the honest, fervent declaration of a man whose loyalty was real, but whose self-knowledge was fatally incomplete. He trusted his passion more than he trusted my prophecy. Then came the darkness of the trial. I stood before the council, silent, enduring the false testimonies. Peter, driven by a deep love but consumed by a paralyzing fear, followed at a distance. He stood by the courtyard fire, trying to blend in, trying to be invisible in a place where my presence was everything. The denial was swift and humiliating, not before a Roman general or a high priest, but before a simple servant girl. The vulnerability of the threat was its greatest power. To be exposed as my follower in that hostile environment was to invite ruin. He denied me with a stammering lie. He denied me with a desperate oath. He denied me finally with curses and swearing, tearing his own soul to convince his accusers, and perhaps himself, that he was separate from the condemned man. The moment that tore my heart was not the sound of his denial, but the sound of the rooster's crow, immediately followed by the sound of our eyes meeting. I was being led across the courtyard, beaten, bruised and bound. He was standing by the fire, suddenly unbound from his lie, shattered by the truth. I looked at him. My gaze held no condemnation, no anger, only an immense, searing sorrow and a profound, eternal love. It was a look that said, "It is done, my son, but I know your heart, and I am with you still." That look shattered him utterly. He fled, weeping bitterly. His sin was unforgivable in the eyes of the world, and certainly in his own eyes. He had denied his master, his friend, his God, in the hour of my deepest need. He was a betrayer, not for silver, but for fear. The guilt he carried was not just the weight of a lie, it was the crushing weight of a broken oath and a failed love. The first act of forgiveness was that look. It was an act of non-condemnation, a silent promise that though he had failed, he was not forsaken. But the full forgiveness, the true restoration, the second time I forgave the unforgivable, came later, after the triumph of the resurrection. My first message from the tomb, delivered by Mary Magdalene, carried a specific instruction. "Go, tell my disciples and Peter that I am going before you to Galilee." The message was deliberately pointed. Peter was separated from the others by his shame. He believed he had lost his right to be called a disciple. He was a failure, a defector. but I ensured his name was called out individually, specifically, to draw him back into the circle. My victory over death was meaningless if it could not overcome the death of a broken heart. Peter, overwhelmed by his shame, had retreated to the only life he knew, fishing. He gathered Thomas, Nathanael, James, and John and declared, "I am going fishing." The others, equally directionless, followed. It was a return to the familiar, a silent declaration that the mission was over for him. He was a fisherman again, not a shepherd of men. They toiled all night, catching nothing. The failure of the fishing mirrored the emptiness in their souls. Then as the dawn broke over the Sea of Galilee, I appeared on the shore. They did not recognize me in the early light. I called out, simple as I had 2 years earlier, "Children, have you any food?" "No," they replied, tired and discouraged. "Cast the net on the right side of the boat, and you will find some." They obeyed, and the net instantly filled with so many fish they could not haul it in. The miracle of provision was a deliberate echo of my first call to them, a sign designed specifically for them to recognize me. John, the beloved, was the first to recognize the pattern. "It is the Lord." But Peter, realizing the presence of the master he had denied, did not wait for the boat to reach the shore. In a flash of his old beautiful impetuousness, he threw on his outer garment and plunged into the sea, swimming towards me. That swim was his second act of repentance, a desperate race to face the very one he had denied. He rushed to the shore, trembling not with cold, but with the fear of the final anticipated judgment. We shared a simple breakfast of bread and fish cooked over a charcoal fire. That charcoal fire was no accident. It was a deliberate stage, designed by me to heal the deepest wound. The very smell, the crackle, the sight of the glowing embers instantly transported Peter back to the courtyard where he had denied me 3 times by another charcoal fire. The location was a sacred echo chamber for his shame. It was here, over this meal, that the second forgiveness was enacted. I did not condemn him. I did not reference the denial directly. I did not ask him to explain his failure. Instead, I focused entirely on his future and his love. I asked him, "Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? More than these? Did I mean the other disciples? Or the nets and the fish, the comfort of his old life?" It meant both. I was asking him, was his love for me stronger than his love for his past comfort, stronger than his self-preservation? Peter replied, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And I gave him the command, "Feed my lambs." I asked him a second time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter repeated his affirmation, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And I repeated the command, "Tend my sheep." I asked him a third time, deliberately using the Greek word phileo, brotherly love, instead of the agape, sacrificial love, I had used before, meeting him exactly where he was, in his human frailty. "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" The third question grieved Peter. He knew I was echoing his 3 denials. He knew I was stripping away his self-confidence entirely. He gave the most humble, sincere, and profound response a flawed human can offer. "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." He admitted his weakness, but appealed directly to my divine knowledge of his true heart. And I gave the final, unconditional command, "Feed my sheep." This was the second time I forgave the unforgivable. It was a methodical, painful, and absolute act of restoration that transcended the betrayal. Peter's sin had been public and tripartite. His forgiveness and restoration were equally public and tripartite. The 3 questions precisely counteracted the 3 denials. The command to feed my sheep 3 times was a resounding declaration that he was not only forgiven, but reinstated to his leadership role. His denial, the very thing that made him unforgivable in the eyes of his own conscience, became the source of his future, profound compassion. You might be standing by your own charcoal fire, consumed by the failure you cannot forgive yourself for. The second time I forgave the unforgivable was not just for Peter. It is for every one of you who has failed after swearing loyalty. My forgiveness is deeper than any denial. If this narrative has brought you hope and conviction, I urge you to share this story. Let others know that restoration is always possible. And before you go, make sure you are subscribed. The next story will reveal another moment of grace that defined the early church. The significance of this second forgiveness is monumental. It teaches us that my grace is not merely granted once, it is continually enacted. It proves that the Father's kingdom is not built on the perfection of its leaders, but on the power of repentance and restoration. Peter, broken of his pride, stripped of his self-reliance, and fully restored by grace, became the very man I needed to lead the early church. He became the voice of the Pentecost, the rock of stability, the one who could speak to those who failed because he himself had failed the Master utterly and been met only with love. His shame became his most powerful tool for empathy. I knew exactly who would deny me, and I knew exactly how I would bring him back. The denial was the painful surgical cut necessary to remove the disease of self-righteousness. The restoration by the charcoal fire was the divine stitching that created a stronger, more compassionate heart, a heart that understood the sheer, overwhelming magnitude of grace. The forgiveness offered to Peter, the forgiveness of the unforgivable sin of denial, is the eternal promise that no failure is final when surrendered to my love.